Hey everyone, we are live. Welcome to Nighttime Logic. We're about a minute early. We'll give you a chance to take your seats, join us in front of your screen or wherever you're tuning in through YouTube. It is Tuesday, February 27th, and you're tuned in to Nighttime Logic. This is the Nighttime Logic program, and I'm here with Dan Franklin. Welcome, Dan. It's great to have you here. I'll be introducing you in a second. Nighttime logic is the part of the story that is often felt and not processed consciously. And that was used from a term of the author Howard Waldrop, who we lost recently. So welcome to Nighttime Logic. I'm a host. I'm Daniel Brum. I often forget to introduce myself. I'm the author of The Night Marchers and Other Strange Tales and The Serpent's Shadow, which are two books from Cemetery Dance Publications, as well as other books and stories that explore the tension between the psychological and the supernatural. Speaking of Cemetery Dance Publications, we have Dan Franklin, who's our guest tonight, is author of The Eater of the Gods and the just released, let's see if I can get it up there, These Things Linger. A little bit about the book, if you haven't checked it out yet. Ghosts, Ghost Eaters, Small Town Blood Magic, and the Crushing Weight of Regrets when Alex Wilson's estranged uncle unexpectedly dies. Alex realizes he would do just about anything to make peace with the man who had raised him as his own. He'd even reach out to the dead. But things more dangerous than ghosts haunt his uncle's broken down trailer and the nearly abandoned one gas station town of Fair Hill just beyond. Things that can devour the living and the dead alike and are all too ready to answer his call. Some parts of our past can never really leave us. These are the things that don't know how to die. These Things Linger, the title of the book. So I'd like to introduce Dan Franklin, author of The Eater of the Gods. He wrote his first attempt at a horror novel when he was 7. It was terrible.
It was.
He's just being... we'll take your word.
It was god-awful. I ripped off the birds.
He has since improved. You have since improved. The winner of several local awards for short stories and an occasional poem. Dan Franklin lives in Maryland with his extremely understanding wife, his cosmically radiant daughter, who I actually met at the sound check, I was fortunate enough, and a socially crippling obsession with things that create. Please welcome Dan Franklin. Thanks for being here, Dan. How are you?
I'm doing all right. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you for letting me ramble on your show.
I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for the opportunity. How's it's a cold day here in New York. How's Maryland treating you today?
God only knows. It changes by the hour. I mean, it's March here, so you'll have it like 70 degrees one day and 12 degrees next, and you just sort of live in denial.
Yeah. Waiting for spring we are. We have some of our friends and colleagues here. Hi, Lisa. Hi, Rebecca. And hi to everyone who's tuning in. Let's start off with how These Things Linger. The very beginning, it opens with a quote from, and I'm going to mangle the way you say the name. It's an Irish musician. Is it Hozier? Is that how you say it?
I believe it is. I don't know if I've ever heard his name out loud. I listen to the music a lot, but I'm not a like socially functioning person who talks out loud to people very often.
Yeah, so. my X-Men superpowers is to mispronounce everything. So let's just not go with my pronunciation. But it's a line, honey, don't feed me. I will come back. Tell us about that line and why did you pick that line to open the book? These Things Linger.
You figure you spend like 9 months to a year writing a book. I mean, it's like having a kid. You listen to music a lot. At least I do. Every night when I'm writing, I have music playing, and you find certain ones that just crop up more and more, and you get a whole kind of vibe towards your book, and it matches with certain singers, certain albums, things like that. And Hozier's just, it really went well with it to me. I mean, the song is itself, it sounds almost like a love story, but it's really more of a threat. It's the guy, I mean, it's warning the person who's singing too of don't invite things in. If you start being nice to me, if you start letting, I'm going to you're not going to end up happy from this all. And it ends with, you'll hear me howling outside your door. I mean, it's not, it's definitely an ominous and kind of unsettling song, but it's also, it starts with a sort of rolling kind of rustic love kind of rhythm and ends up with a heartbeat sort of throbbing threat to it. And it's just fantastic. I love it. And I love music in general, especially lyric heavy songs. And it's,
yeah, and that one really does. I could see how it fits the rough. We don't want to give it away, but I could see how it fits the thematic outline of these things. Linger, and also something that you said reminded me of a song. You said, "Oh, it sounds like a love song, but when you think about it, it's really a threat." I'm showing my age here. There's a song by Sarah McLachlan that sounded just like that. It's called
Possession.
It's called Possession. Yeah, and
I know my Sarah McLachlan. Absolutely, I'd embarrass myself by reciting it.
It sounds like this beautiful love song. But whenever she talks about it, she's like, "Oh no, those lyrics are word for word written from my stalker." You know, and so she just turned it around and made it into this beautiful song. But you've taken that song and used it for inspiration for the book. Let's talk a little bit about, we were talking backstage here about marketing a bit, and about how it's an art and a science. So these things linger. We're calling it a supernatural thriller, and like the categories are for people outside of us when we're writing. But yeah, take a stab at it. What would you take a stab at, no pun intended, a definition of a supernatural thriller, or what are the things that might check the box of something like that in general?
I mean, horror has a heavy overlap with thrillers, I feel like, and there's a central theme of trying to figure out what the threat is, what's going on, and how to address it. It's not all the way towards a Catcher on Ward type of just full out mystery, but there is a plot where there's a thread of a lot of different parts of the plot where you're not really certain what's happening. As you find it pivots to another direction. And that kind of is the corner of what I think of thrillers as, where it's a lot of tension while you're trying to figure things out, while you're trying to approach it. Well, will this work? Will this fix things? Will this help things? I mean, it basically starts off with a mistake, and it's trying to fix that mistake the entire time, and it keeps building on itself and getting worse and worse, and each attempt to fix it makes things massively worse. Which
I like that definition, and it is fitting because it goes to a lot of different elements. But you are talking about pace. I mean, you're talking about revelation of information. You're talking about conflict and tension. And you are talking about pace. As you were speaking, I know that you're a fan of Joe Hill, and you were describing really perfectly one of my favorites by Joe Hill. I think it was his novel, Heart Shaped Box. Sounds
so good.
A lot like it's so unique, and it's such a simple structure. And I could see, I could see how that structure and that pace influences these things. Like, for those of you who don't know, without spoiling Heart Shaped Box, there's a problem. Our narrator has acquired a ghost, and in a very big ways, everything the narrator does to get rid of the ghost makes it worse and propels it into a different thing. So you're really unsettled because you're like, oh, I thought for sure that would work.
Yeah.
And then it doesn't. And there's a lot of in these things linger too, where you're like, you just want these people to go on with their life and have it, and they're so earnestly trying to do things, and maybe some of the things do make it worse.
And it sort of has the Greek tragedy kind of thing where you were pretty good at the start, you tried to make it better, and you end up gripping water. It's just coming out through your fingers, and Joe Hill does that really well, but it shows up all over the place, and it's just I love that structure. So it was really fun writing that. But
yeah, you have a cool structure, and it's a really fast paced read. I really impressed with the chapter length and pacing. It reminds me of someone who has like short chapters that pivot. I'm thinking about classic Michael Crichton. Kind of had these
I
really short
love Michael
chapters,
Crichton. I have a shelf.
and you get to the end of a chapter, and you're like, one more, I gotta do one more. And I definitely saw that happening in These Things Linger, where you have a thing going on. Like a lot of your chapters end with that. You mentioned that pivot. It ends with that pivot where you're like, oh, fuck, excuse me. Yeah, it kind of ends with that there.
And it's also, I can't, as much as I wish I could pull a Scott Smith and write like he does The Ruins, where it's just, I don't think there's chapters. Like it just goes start to finish, just pivoting viewpoints as people get near each other. It jumps from person to person. I don't know if
wow.
I can't do that. I don't have that in me.
I love that movie. Actually, it really grew me. I never read I've been meaning to read that book, but
gorgeous. But
I really.
But I'm more of a short chapter, kind of like 2,500 words, 2,500 words per chapter, where you can hit the beats and it moves. It just makes it fun to read. I like having just like chapter titles, things like that. It's just so fun.
It's definitely a fast-paced, fun read. So you make it look easy. I want to talk a lot more about These Things Linger, but before we dive too deep into it, I do want to ask you about your previous novel. I think it just celebrated a book birthday, or it's about
to in this weekend, I think, maybe.
Oh, all right. Happy as a fellow author, I know how important these things are. So happy book birthday to The Eater of the Gods. And that was out last year from Cemetery Dance.
It had been a limited edition first, but then it went dormant afterwards, because I mean that's usually what you figure for. But I had enough traction from some people who said they wanted it in trade edition, so I went forward with it, and it actually worked out well. I liked it.
That's great. Bring us up to speed. Those who may not have checked it out yet, give us like a little bit about what Eater of the Gods is about.
The Eater of Gods is one of the. It started. A reviewer, Mark Sieber, lamented that there were no more. That he hadn't read an actual old school mummy story in a while, ever since the Brendan Fraser movies, which I do love, but they're a very different take on the mummy mythologies and paradigm. So this is more of the old version, where it's all about loss and about being wronged. I mean, the original stories were usually a female figure from ancient Egypt, whatever, their tombs being broken into and looted, and they don't appreciate it. And it's about them feeling like, you stole my rest. This wasn't right. It's a resentment kind of thing. And that's heavily what I base the story on. It's, and it parallels, you have Kia, who is the figure, who is actually a real person who got deleted basically from history, recently rediscovered. We've never found her tomb or anything. She was the queen to the heretic pharaoh. And with all the guys who wanted to erase all the gods and all that. So you have her paralleled with the professor who's looking for picking up his dead wife's research. And it's a lot about grief and resentment and how that can turn you and transform you into something else. And
Akhenaten, if I'm not mistaken, is that the name of that pharaoh?
Yes.
I mean, I'm a sucker for the mummy stories. I love them, and Eater of the Gods. It sounds so cool, and to have that old school mummy story, and to have some real life mysteries, of not finding the tomb yet. I'm looking at the comments.
It parallels like real things that we all feel and understand too. I mean, it's about losing things and about resenting even your God, resenting your beliefs and your structures. You say, I put out into the world, I put all this out, and what did I get back? And there is a temptation to feel that way. I mean, I lost family. I mean, you lost my dad, then you watch how that impacts my mom. I mean, she was 50 years old. She lost her husband for life. I mean, that's hard watching that. She didn't do anything wrong. She didn't deserve it. And you see this, and had my best friend lose his little brother to cancer. And you see these things happen again and again. And you can see how it erodes people, and it erodes me. It erodes easily. It's hard to look at things and say, oh, it's okay, because it's not. And you do feel angry, and you do want someone to answer for it. And that's a lot of the heart of what Eater of Gods is about, is that how that can drive you to becoming something somewhat damaged or really damaged.
Wow, that's a powerful thought right there. We have a question from our audience, so I'm going to get to that in a second. I just want to follow up on that first, though. So, feeling allowing yourself to feel. I like what you said. Or like is it it's a powerful notion what you said to say, yeah, I'm not going to say it's okay when it isn't. Do you use that to inspire your writing, to inspire the human aspects of your characters, these personal losses in your life?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I have a lot of different grief things that address different issues or different. When you're writing, you're pouring out part of yourself, you're pulling it out, and the interesting things are always the ugly ones that you don't want to talk about or you don't want to think about too much.
Yes.
Make it interesting to read. I had a professor who was talking about write things that are embarrassing. You don't want
Yes.
to hear about a good day. You want to hear about somebody's erectile dysfunction is the example he used. And he's kind of right. You hear one of them, you're like, oh, what's happening? And then the other one, whatever. But
well, it goes from being generic to being specific. And there's a Joseph Campbell quote where we thought we had been all alone. We really are with all the world, and you're like, oh, I thought that was just me. And if you could do something brave, like talk about your loss, I thought that was really brave that you mentioned it. I thought that was really brave that you mentioned it in a forthcoming interview that we did together, a written one. And I think it makes for good writing. It makes for it's interesting, but it also it makes other people braver too, and it makes for real depth of character.
And it feels more genuine. I mean, I have depression issues. Obviously, it's in these things linger. You can see it seeps in around the edges. Like these things show up in everything I write. Parts of issues or parts of fears. I mean, personal fears. If you're actually scared of something and you write it, it's a lot scarier than if it's something that you have. It's like, but. So if you can feed into them, you can run with it. But
you said you had a professor who said to write about those things that are embarrassing, and it reminded me. He wasn't my professor, but he sometimes did teach students. The great, I think he's a cemetery dance author as well. The great Jack Ketchum. He would tell his students, like, the one thing that, and may he rest in peace. We lost him relatively recently. Mm-hmm. One of the things that he did tell students like myself was, I think his catch term was don't look away. Mm-hmm. And his exercises were to find those things, as you said, find that thing that you don't want to write about, find the thing that you want to hide, find that thing that you is very personal to you, and then face it, and then try to channel it into your writing. And that's easier said than done. How do you do that? Is that a conscious process for you, or is it that you just find it comes in, or a little bit of both?
A little bit of both. You start with certain things, and then it just leaks in as you do it. It comes up, and you can choose to either bury it or not. I mean, obviously, Jack Ketchum, like, he's the best at that kind of thing, of writing things that disturb and unsettle. I mean, most of his stuff hammers on the point of people, no matter how prepared you are, you don't always get what you deserve. There's so much is chance, and so much goes bad. And that's it's a fantastic thing to hit. It's a lot of his work, but a lot of stuff in general itself. And you do a scene or two, and then you start, well, this character feels this way or does that way, and then slowly they kind of do their own thing. I'm not a complete planner. I'm not a complete pantser either. I'm somewhere in between the two. So I'll start with a scene or two scenes or something that I write and I really like, and then you start building on how they branch out and how they connect and work from there. And you end up putting yourself together.
Stop me if I get too personal with any of the questions, but I know that you are a family man, and in these things linger. There's family is at the core of it. Some of your influences are family-based novels and horror. How much? What were the starting points? How much of Dan is in some of the fears in these things lingers?
There's definitely some. I mean,
how much of your fears
first wrote it around when my wife was just when we were trying to get pregnant. We had about a year where we were trying to get pregnant, and it started that. I mean, she was an ER nurse at the time who specialized in phlebotomy. There's a phlebotomist who is the wife of the fiance of the main character in these things. Like, there's definite parallels, and with where I grew up, that kind of thing. Because Maryland, I've been all over Maryland, so but you pull on yourself and you put yourself into things. I'm not the main character isn't me, but you can put different scenarios that you lived. I only put myself as the main character in one thing. I'm never going to publish it. And I was it was really nasty and mean. It was funny because it was just a whatever 60,000 word insult, and it was really funny. But it wasn't like it didn't have enough momentum to pull together and actually be a book necessarily. But I have a manuscript lying on the ground somewhere. But it's fun.
I want to come back to some of the influences, but before we run too far, I'll put the question. Lisa asked, "Can you tell us?" This is going back to I think this is Eater of the Gods. What about some of that research went into Eater of the Gods, and are you a part-time archaeologist?
No, I'm a lot of things, but I wish. No, fortunately, the internet is a wonderful and terrible thing, but I managed to find some archaeologists, some poor Canadian archaeologist who's going to send me texts on a bunch of different hieroglyphics and chat me through a bunch of the different stuff. And I think she was just startled that anybody would like. It's not a chat up line. I'm asking about the Ninth Dynasty, these different things. I'm just like,
yeah.
So what are you doing? It's like,
I think it's fascinating. I think it's fascinating. I took a class in college, and I like the documentaries. I like the more science based ones myself than some of the more far out ones. But Akhenaten certainly is a really fascinating figure in history, and it's really cool.
And I grew up with textbooks of that stuff. My mom was into it, so she had Stephen King, and she had Egyptology, and she had ancient, all sorts of stuff, just books all over the house. So it's awesome.
Very cool. Let's get back to some of your influences. What are some of your favorite writers, and how do they influence your writing?
I mean, I Am Legend's my favorite book of all time. Richard Matheson. The ending is one of those ones that I can read it as many times as I want, and it'll hit me, just knock me straight down every single time. It's my favorite book ever written, and it's just the pinnacle.
What hell of a book.
And then, I mean, Joe Hill, Keelan Patrick Burke, who they just managed to catch. I mean, like, they have magic in them. I mean, you read it and it's like, you can feel it. It's something, God, they're good. I mean, but there's all sorts of books. I mean, I love, everybody who writes starts out as a reader. I have just whole bookcases full of books sitting over there that are slices of something more. It's so cool.
Yeah, I love,
those early King stuff too. I mean, I when I mentioned Joe Hill, all those guys, I'm not trying to exclude anybody. I mean, Pet Sematary, Shining, Harry, those especially those early King when he was still so angry, and you get Cujo. I mean, God, Cujo is so strong. I mean, I love books. So we are all birds of a feather. I love the passion and enthusiasm that you're showing there. We won't go into spoiler territory, but we talked about the opening quote of These Things Linger, but very early on in the first chapter, I think it's called The Fisher. And by the way, all these short chapters have like a cool name, so it's really a lot of fun to read. So in the first chapter, The Fisher, I think Alex's Uncle Matt has a little notion. He says, "The greatest blessing is a line that breaks." Tell us about that, and because it also relates to a lot of these books you're talking about. Mm-hmm. I see the influence there. I see the line to it. Yeah, and it's sort of it's indicating what the whole book has as an underlying current to it, and it's the idea that you think you want something, but you don't know if you really want that. You go hunting for something, and you might find a little more than you want. I mean, even if you think about fishing itself, you're dropping a hook down into the water, hoping to draw something up, but something down there is doing the exact same. It sees food, and it's like, oh, I want to go get it. And it's all the same, like, you don't know which part you are. Are you the one getting lured in, or are you luring something in? And it's just I just like the concept of it. It's just a really cool, like...
There's a lot of variation in theme of that notion. I see it throughout. The book is in different parts, different chapters, and
throughout horror in general, it's a theme that shows up. It's cool.
Yeah. You dedicate, in addition to dedicating the book to your wife and kids, you dedicate it to those cursed by their ancestry and to those whose burden lingers. The first few chapters of the book, you give us a really great picture of Alex and his life on the border of college, pre-adulthood. Tell us about introduce us to the character Alex Wilson and his ancestry, and what is his burden?
His burden is somewhat fear, and a lot of it is fear. It's his uncle's fears about certain things that get transposed onto him. He's afraid of supernatural things. He's scared of all kinds of stuff. And the way he deals with it is either pulling away from it or almost purposely denying that there's any threat to what he's doing. I mean, he has to, at certain points, he makes decisions that are deliberately not bad, but sort of a defiance of, well, this can't go wrong. And it does, and it can. And he's grown up really poor. He's grown up with very little of anything and trying to prove himself, trying to stand up to this when his, I mean, we all grew up with saying Bloody Mary in front of the mirrors and stuff like that. We all grew up with that kind of stuff. But for him, it's not a joke. It's really a test. Every one of these things is. And somewhere along the way, he crossed into where he's doing things that he shouldn't do, and he can't recognize the difference between one being fun in front of a mirror and one where you're bleeding on the floor because you are trying to speak to the dead and you've opened your wrist. I mean, that's a big disparity between the two, and he can't really see what is okay and what isn't too much at some point.
And there's a lot of the tension is around just that point there. So very early on in the book, he finds himself mixed up in magic and a ritual. Tell us about that ritual and that magic and the character that sort of brings that to Alex.
And I mean, it's another character who's largely desperate, but she's just a teenage girl. She doesn't realize what she's doing. When she does, she stops. Like, she's trying to reach out to her brother. She lost, so she's just misses him. It's your first friend is your sibling generally, and she misses him so much she's willing to try. I mean, she's going through her own depression. It's hard being a teenager in any circumstance, and hers is not an easy one. And she's trying to reach out, and she doesn't realize she succeeded, but she does kind of realize she's gone too far, and it does end up, she gets stopped up. But Alex is the one who realizes that it went farther than she thought, and there's a somewhat conflict. So he pulls away from her, and she doesn't really know what's happened until later in the story when all the threads start pulling back together. But the burden we all carry. I mean, my kids are going to get depression. They're going to have it happen. You give them a hot load of genetics, it's something they'll have to deal with. They'll have different stuff. We pass that on, and there's good things we pass on, the tools to deal with it, but there's also problems. I mean, it's not going to be easy. It's not for anyone. But also the line "Cursed by Ancestry" is something of a nod to Manchester Orchestra, a different song thing, which...
Oh, okay.
I have a song, The Silence, the singer says, "Little girl, you are cursed by my ancestry." And it's like he's singing to his daughter, saying, it's like, you've got every bit of poison that I'm carrying too. And it's like, ooh, that's such a... Whew.
Yeah, there's a lot. I could see the lyricist or poet in you there. And I like what you said about there's a lot of verisimilitude in that, about the way that we here in the real life, not on the pages, relate to the supernatural. Because like in the book, yeah, something happens with Alex and the character Lacey, and as Dan said, the reader or Alex maybe realizes that something went, Lacey really wasn't, the witch, or the spell book wasn't real. We, the reader, know that there's something more going on, and then the story accelerates. As in life, sometimes we just we don't know where to put it, and we go on with our life. And Alex goes on with his life, and we see him really leave the town of Fairhill behind. We see him go on with his life. We see him get engaged and even married and begin his career. But then we find him coming back to the small town after graduating, after getting married, and leaving it a lot behind. He's an engineer, and he's a professional. And at one point, when he's narrating to us, he says he sees himself as living in the world of rationality. But then there's a chapter, The Lake and the Revenant. Tell us about the strange encounters, and when he goes back, what happens to him, and
he mostly
to his burden.
he starts opening a door. He's has a loss of his own. He decides to look back, and I mean, this is the very first couple chapters to tell you most of the stuff, so it's not really much in spoiler territory. But he goes back to his childhood home, which he had stayed away from. He had pulled so far away from all that, and he starts looking at it and just letting it sink back into him and enmeshing himself in that world just for a couple hours. Even he's looking through his old stuff, and it comes back as, wait, it worked before. I know how to reach out. Like, I know it worked, and he's denied it for so long that he won't even really let himself admit what he's setting himself up to do. He's circling and circling the end point that he knows he's going to, but which parallels the alcoholism, his dad's alcoholism, his uncle's alcoholism, things like that, where you start at the beginning of the night, oh, I won't do that, but you know darn well by the end of the night you will. And you just try to come up with different ways to put yourself out there without realizing you're putting yourself closer and closer to a bad decision. And that's what he's doing throughout that. And then things start going bad, pretty bad after that. Yeah.
Yes, they do. They're great chapters. Will you, speaking of them, will you give a reading? We'll turn it over to you and read.
Sure, I can read this. I can read this.
All right, I'm going to turn the screen over to you, and here's Dan Franklin reading from These Things Linger.
Alrighty, I'm just going to start with saying The Revenant and the Lakes. That's 2 chapters, but chapter 6 is The Revenant. So, the optimism of television shows applies to houses too. Tiny houses are lauded as chic and desirable, a symbol of elitism and traveling. I spent more than my fair share of nights curled up on a hard, sweaty cot packed in a tight corner of the kitchen, and I can confirm that's all a lie. A tiny house is just a pretty trailer, and an ugly trailer is a bit of a shit show. My uncle's double wide, it was the shittiest. Unlike the rest of the fair hell, which seemed to have constricted upon itself in my absence, the trailer was exactly as I had remembered it. Quaint was too timid a term. Either a laughable, double wide, or almost impressive single, it had likely once been a proud beast, but my earliest memories of it did not include it having wheels. The beige siding, yellow blinds blocking dirty windows, the stainless steel steps that proved stainless was something of a relative term. Bathed in the headlights, it was easy to believe that it had shared a fellow lifeline with my uncle. The once proud American flag he had draped across the front window as a makeshift curtain had turned sun-faded and white and now hung in surrender like laundry laid out to dry. Even by Fair Hill standards, I grew up poor. As a child, I didn't understand how poor I was, but it had never been all that important. Seeing it again brought an unexpected pang of pleasure, and I caught myself smiling fondly at my innocence. I missed the trailer. Not the cracked paneling or the filthy windows, but the aura it seemed to exude. Those sticky summers, the humble persistence that kept it from collapsing into wreckage despite wind and rain and the destructive force of my youth. There was nothing maternal or particularly comforting about my uncle's trailer. No pencil lines to mark my height over the years. No den for me to sprawl on my belly and flip through baseball cards, but there was an honesty to it. A purpose. I flipped through my cards among the legs of a collapsible kitchen table, and I measured my height against a fishing pole. Even sweat seemed more valuable here. Plunging my hands into the slick, muddy earth of the backyard and dredging up curling bodies of worms until I was painted brown felt far more like honest work than engineering ever had. My first birthday I remembered happened here. My first taste of ice cream scooped out of a cheap plastic bowl. I caught the bus to my first day of school and my uncle waved goodbye. His eyes were damp. The first fish I caught hooked out back, and the first time I had sex was on a musty blanket in the back of Kylie Mackinson's pickup truck parked up front just before heading off to college. No one, not even my uncle, believed me about that last one. It only hurt my ego a little. I didn't just miss the trailer, I missed the simplicity, where the only thing that matters, my imagination, my uncle's curt, sharp words of reprimand when I pushed too far against the few rules he established. Don't hurt anyone you don't need to hurt, don't steal, and don't be a damn idiot. I've broken all of them, of course, but anyone who hasn't has never been a child. I missed my uncle. I stepped out into the night and closed the door behind myself as the chirping bugs railed their brainless din among the tall grass that had overtaken the yard. The lake out back looked like a black plastic bag stretched taut up beneath an endless night sky. The legs of the old pier punched into it, rotted and mossy, eroded thin and strangely stork-like as they devoted their feeble strength to the few planks remaining. Home sweet home. I navigated a path through the brush to the beige, ivy facade and up the steps to the padlocked door. A twist of the key, and I pushed my way inside. The place was heavy with stale, strangely moldy scent of the elderly and a lurking trace of the lake's decay, so like the smell of slaughtered pigs. Throughout my childhood, my uncle had been orderly to an extreme, just shy of obsessive, but it was immediately apparent that he had overcome any of those issues since I'd left. The trailer was a disaster. Countless beer cans, Tupperware bowls stained red from canned chili, tinfoil and cigarette butts and wrappers from God only knew what were strewn about like dusty confetti. I hung the keys on the nail beside the door and I let out a quiet musical jingle. No matter what the will said, it wasn't mine. I was a stranger here. It was a fond memory, but it was only that. A dream falling into senseless, windswept distance upon waking. I'd only left it for a moment, it seemed, but that was too long. I wondered if everyone felt this way about their first home. I stepped by the cramped kitchen with its toaster oven in lieu of a proper oven, and a bucket-rigged sink full of dirty dishes, the tiny kitchen table under the looming cabinets, features so prominent in my childhood that I felt like I was growing younger with each step. The small room where I used to sleep, the bed the exact way I'd left it, my uncle's faded yellow chair cracked with age and duct-taped into submission in front of it, a TV with tinfoil, and in front of it, a TV with tinfoil tentacles sprouting out. That, as I remembered, actually yielded fairly solid reception. A quilted blanket was pulled around my chair's feet. On a shelf above it, a line of clumsily carved duck decoys pockmarked with bird shot that would fool only the least savvy of birds. Hand-carved gifts from Buzz. Next to them, a picture of my uncle and me from that summer when I first learned to fish. I picked the blanket up, folded, and set it over the back of the chair. I peeked in the tiny bathroom with its cramped shower stall and the cut milk jug attached as a urinal to the plumbing on the wall. There was a bucket beside it, just as I remembered for when you couldn't make it outside. It was filthy, and metallic green flies hummed fitfully above it. I pulled the door closed until it clicked. His bedroom was marginally neater, but mostly because it looked as if he rarely entered anymore. A twin-sized bed, a small dresser, and a nightstand. A suitcase by the foot of the bed piled high with clothing and ready for him to zip it up and take to the laundromat, as it likely had been for months. A pair of pictures stood on the nightstand peeking out past an overladen ashtray and a cluster of beer cans. One of him and Buzz, the other one of me. One of him and Buzz, and the other of me. It was remarkable how similar my uncle and I looked. Like two casts from the same mold, just different aged. The same blue eyes, the same sharp jaw, the same sheepish hairline. I stepped closer to see it more clearly and kicked my way through beer cans laying fallen like fallen soldiers after a finished battle. Cans upon cans, but not a single bottle. I swallowed hard. He never met Rachel. He never knew she was pregnant. I just hadn't expected all of this, and so suddenly, but it wasn't really sudden, I supposed. It had been years since I last spoke to him, and he treated life like work shift near over. It shouldn't have been a surprise that he would join everyone in the boneyard of mortality. People die. Parents die. I was an engineer. Practicality and rationality were two of my highest callings. And even if I weren't, my time in Fair Hill had made me no stranger to death. But the idea that such a twisted roll of the dice could fall from the hand of someone I was tied to, someone who had sweat and bled to feed me, a thankless child of his dead sister, it was all wrong. I examined the picture for a moment, again of us fishing, but this time I was 16 and beaming with delight, holding up a reasonably sized bass beside the boat. In the reflection of the glass, I saw a smile that mirrored mine from so long ago. I picked up one of the cans to move it out of the picture's way, and it sloshed heavily, the stale stench of urine spilling out. I set the can back down. I wanted to believe that there was something missing, something I'd overlooked, some hidden piece of an unseen design that was knocked out of alignment and waiting for me to put it back into place. How like him, to hide a final lesson among the rubble of his death. I wanted to believe there was a higher reason behind it all, but the quiet voice of logic whispered that there was no meaning to anything. He was simply gone. The entropic doom of the trailer seemed wrong and cruel, and he should have kept it clean. He should have fought harder. He should have known that letting go with one hand meant letting go with both. He should have held to who he was even when there was no one left to check up on him. He'd let his demons devour him. I wanted to shake the man I know, to scream in his face, demand to know why he'd let things come to this. Why he hadn't simply asked for help. I didn't throw the beer can or break the ashtray or rail or yell or cry. I'm not that melodramatic. Acting in anger always seemed a bit foreign to me, a wasted effort. If something makes you angry, fix it or you ignore it. Nonetheless, I realized that I was indeed angry. picture of us smiling side by side next to the boat seemed like a sadistic joke. Only the pictures had stayed cleaned and dusted, and that didn't really change anything. There was nothing to change. Whatever I'd come for, this wasn't it. I made my way back to the front door where I surveyed my domain one last time. All in all, it wasn't worth much. The will bequeathed everything he owned to me, but the summary of value after the funeral was probably a month's paycheck. How he'd afforded to help me pay my student loans without leaving a mountain of debt was just shy of becoming the eighth wonder of the world. I took the keys from the nail beside the door and crossed the back of the trailer, where a padlocked plastic shed was hooked up. He had affectionately named it the boathouse, and I had trouble thinking of it as anything else. This, more than anything else, was what I remembered. My Shangri-La back then. Even though everything else had failed, I felt sure it wouldn't disappoint me. The rusty lock sprang open without any hesitation, despite its age. I stepped inside and instinctively reached to the shelf beside the door for the old electric railroad lantern that we always used instead of an overhead. I clicked it on and the yellow light bathed the shed. In contrast to the general chaos of the house, the garage was still aggressively ordered. Tools hung from a corkboard wall. A few small metal cabinets with drawers labeled in yellowing paper tabs lined the cramped wall space. Even the streamers of cobwebs which hung like a ceiling canopy seemed carefully arranged. In the center of it all, his pride and joy, the patchwork aluminum monstrosity he named the Buzzard. It sat on a wooden trolley looking tired and ancient. I smiled and ran my hands along the chilly edge. The soldering had rusted and the seat had warped with rot. Mold had lived and struggled and died along its outer hull, leaving metal brown instead of mossy. It looked like it had forgotten its purpose. I wondered if it'd still float. I was pretty certain it would. I went through the motions automatically. I unscrewed the stainless metal bubble over the engine and poked about. I checked and liberally greased every moving part I could reach. The fuel tank itself only opened after a significant amount of struggle. The contents of the tank were dark and sour, so I siphoned them off and refilled it from the jerry can mixture of oil and gasoline kept in the corner. It wasn't within regulations, and pound for pound it probably caused similar environmental damage to the bomb dropped on Nagasaki, but when I gave the engine a tug, it gave an asthmatic sputter and the propeller swiveled easily. Without questioning the impulse, I pushed the doors open behind me and wheeled the trolley out, its aged cargo aboard. I wanted to take out one more time, needed one more trip out onto the lake, one final goodbye to my uncle, to Fair Hill, to my old way of life. Genetically, I was the last of the Wilsons, but in reality, our lineage had died out with my uncle. It deserved some closure. Any child of mine would share only blood with my ancestors. I could only assume my deviations came from my father, and I never much cared to know his qualities. I gripped the gnarled rope and heaved the trolley out through the long, dew-wet fingers of grass and up to the gravel patch beside the pier. The pier looked every bit as unstable as I remembered, so I went through the brush instead, up to the waterline. I wrinkled my nose automatically. The lake was near stagnant, and it breathed a smell far too reminiscent of when my uncle came home from the plant full of cloying decay and ammonia. I roped the trolley to the knobby wooden post at the pier's entrance and placed the flashlight next to it, lit and pointing upwards like a searchlight. I eased the trolley forward until the wheels dipped into the placid, glassy face. I pushed the boat off the trolley out until the dark water leached slick and cold over the tops of my boots, and then I climbed inside. I pushed at the ground with a wooden pole my uncle kept strapped to the side of the boat until it was clear of shore and I could slide the engine in deeper. I gave the cord a yank, and the engine coughed into life and propelled me out across the black abyss. The moon had climbed high into the sky, a gleaming silver orb, almost full and glinting down off the gentle ripples that the small boat emanated in its passing. The air was cold and clear and sharp and cut away at the lake's foul breath. By the time I reached the center of the lake, the old fishing spot that I knew so well, I was shivering against the October winds. When I looked back toward the trailer, the flashlight I'd left at the pier was the only tiny blemish against the dark horizon of the bank. I turned the engine off and looked up into the crowd of stars. I'd sat out here so often. When it was cold, I'd clutch coffee. When it was warm, we'd eat while out on the water as often as not. There was so much that I would have changed over the last years, so much I would have said and asked and done, but there was at least always this. I tried to rekindle my anger, but it was hard to stew in bitterness out on the piece of water with my breath slow and deep and steaming. The boat rocked gently, sloshing around a small trickle of water that was seeping through a crack in the soldering beside my foot. I watched it and simply sat thinking of nothing and enjoying the rhythmic shift of the water like the pulse of a heartbeat. It was oddly relaxing, the throb of the living planet, the feeling of presence and isolation simultaneous and womb-like. The chill was about the only thing that kept the drowsiness at bay, and it occurred to me that it was probably well after midnight and I had a 4-hour drive ahead of me, even if I sped. My time was up. When I tried to start the engine to direct myself back toward the pier, it gagged and sputtered but wouldn't turn. I cursed it out of habit as I flipped my pocket knife out and slipped the edge into the screw heads. I twisted and popped the metal bubble off so that I could better fiddle with the internals of the little engine that couldn't. As usual, the fuel line had detached from the carburetor. I fished it out, and after a few minutes of blind tinkering, I slipped it back into place and primed it. When the engine let out a snort, when I tried the engine again, it let out a snort that smelled like burning rubber and began to vibrate again with dubious purpose. Revived. I hadn't lost all the skills from my childhood then. I caught myself staring at the knife in my hands. Revived. The tiny pooling of water by my foot gurgled merrily. Come naked. For a moment, it was like she was sitting there in the boat with me. I'd almost forgotten about Lacey Jameson and that clammy sweat of that afternoon. But looking down at the tiny dark pool pulsing like a cut vein, the memory etched itself so clearly that I could taste the pot in her mouth, see the flickering patterns that the bathwater had inscribed across the walls and the ceiling. Water amplifies, blood binds, fire summons. Revival. She had been trying to talk with the dead. I pulled my shirt off, balled it up, and set it on the bench next to me. A rash of goosebumps spread over my body, and I shivered hard enough to set the boat rocking. I considered removing my pants too, but I thought better of it. She'd said the degree wasn't as important as the gesture anyway, and the thought of frostbitten genitals earned a shiver all of its own. Oof. Blood to bind, I said. Before I convinced myself how stupid the idea was, I flipped the pocket knife over in my hand and dragged it in one sharp slasher along the back of my left forearm. I felt the curious looseness even before the pain set in, a stinging fork of lightning that branched up to my shoulders, tan skin splitting open into a thin, hot river. The cut was deep, far deeper than I'd intended, and I clenched my fist to keep my hands from shaking. In the moonlight, the blood looked black. Steam rose from it like smoke. I set the knife down on the bench beside my shirt and held my arm out away from me to keep any blood from getting on my pants. It pattered against the aluminum floor, mixing with the water that had leaked in. I couldn't help but think of all the blood I'd seen pooled there before, countless gutted fish mixing their fluids with brackish water in the bottom of the boat, until it slopped about like pinkish soup around my bare feet. The sequined sparkle of scraped scales glittering from its depths. How the fish had flopped and flailed even after they were cut and bled when it was far too late for any but God to intervene. A bled fish tasted better, my uncle always claimed. At the end of a good day, my uncles were mottled pale red and puckered from soaking in the aftermath. A circle makes the gateway. I gripped the side of the boat with my injured hand and leaned forward on the warped bench. I smeared the little blood into a messy circle in the center of the boat with my good hand, stroke after stroke. I reached into the pocket of my pants and groped around till I found the lighter. I pulled it out. Fire to summon. I flipped the spur. A tiny yellow flame leapt into being, so sudden and purely glowing that even though the infant flame failed to illuminate the boat, the night around me faded darker by contrast. Bugs hummed and the trees swayed in a gentle, distant breeze. The flame danced, but held. Water to amplify, I said at last. I thrust my wounded arm out over the side of the boat and tilted my hand downward. The wet warmth streamed down my wrist, climbed between my knuckles, and splashed into the lake. Matthew Wilson, Matthew Wilson, Matthew Wilson, I said. I squeezed my fist tighter, and the rush of warmth came again. It felt wrong saying his name like this. A private sacrilege. He had always been Uncle Matty to me. To reduce him to just another Matthew seemed a blasphemy. For a moment, I hesitated, the sting of my arm throbbing like a quiet alarm, but it was too late to turn back now. Matthew Wilson, Matthew Wilson, Matthew Wilson. I held my arm there until the trickling stopped slowed into a drip, drip, drip. My arm was beginning to feel numb, either from the chill of the night or the blood loss. A sensation of dizziness washed over me, and I forced myself to take deeper, slower breaths. Matthew Wilson, Matthew Wilson, Matthew Wilson. The dripping stopped. My heartbeat thudded in an unsteady rhythm. I wondered how it would happen. Would he appear sitting across from me? Would I hear his voice in my head? Maybe just a certainty, a feeling of togetherness that would make it all okay. It would make me understand how he had fallen so far, so quickly. That would make me understand why he had failed me. I waited. Nothing. My silent anticipation gave way to a feeling of disgust. I flipped the lighter closed. Of course nothing had happened. It was a stupid game. My muddled memories of footprints in a tub were another fantasy born from fear. There were 1,000 better explanations. I was a reasonable, learned man. an engineer, and here I was sitting in the middle of the lake at an ungodly hour, bleeding my dead uncle's filthy old boat, trying to some half-baked ritual in an attempt to, what, catch up years after I'd walked out, unweave his history of self-destruction, ask for his forgiveness, or ask to forgive him, blur the line between the living and the dead. The line wasn't some malleable divide, it was a simple wall. On one side lay firing synapses and animation. On the other lay darkness as still as the water around me. I wondered how I was going to explain the cut to Rachel. I flicked stray droplets from my fingers and turned to reach for the engine when something struck the bottom of the boat hard enough to knock me up to my hands and knees. The aluminum hull reverberated like a gong.
All right, that's a great chapter ending, and maybe let's leave it at that cliffhanger right there. Thank you so much. That was great. Thanks. So that was one of the chapters.
Chapter 6.
Chapter 6, The Revenant, from These Things Linger by Dan Franklin from Cemetery Dance, which we're a little bit past the halfway point of the show. So Dan, what's the best way for people? We have Cemetery Dance online where they can grab These Things Linger. And also it's available at any bookstores you want to promote, or on Amazon, or where's the best place to pick it up?
You can do it directly from me. You can get through Cemetery Dance or through Amazon. There are some bookstores. I don't know which specific ones too well. Oh, hello, Malfi. Ooh, sorry, I love Malfi. You're amazing. Your books are fantastic.
All right, fist bump from fellow author Ron Malfi. Great. Head over to Cemetery Dance or your local book. Ask for your local bookstore or an Amazon.
And if you want it drawn in, I like to draw in books. I like defacing properties, so just ask me, and I'm happy to draw whatever.
Fantastic. So before we move on, I want to talk. There's so much more I want to talk to about this book, but we're going to just take. I want to give a couple of shout outs to some friends of the show. One friend of the show is another podcast that I do recommend. It's called Horror from the High Desert. It's a podcast hosted by author Scotty Mildner. So check that out. That's Horror from the High Desert, wherever you get your podcasts. I believe this month or this week, I think it's a weekly, his guest is Gwendolyn Keist, who's an author I'm fond of as well. And also here is Gwendolyn Keist's book that I think it's coming out very soon. Her book is called The Haunting. The Haunting of Velkwood.
It's really good.
It's a great book. It's a great ghost story. If you read Gwendolyn Keist, you know that she really has a unique way with ghost stories. So check her out on Horror from the High Desert. And next month, I'll be posting the exact date and the event page. She'll be right here at Nighttime Logic. So it will be 2 places where you can tune in and talk to Gwendolyn. Some other shout outs. I got some cool book mail from friend and fellow author Matt Cohen. A book, I believe it's a journal called Nightmare Abbey, a couple of copies of it. Nightmare Abbey, Haunted Houses, Tormented Souls, and the Creeping Unknown. And another one, it's full of great work. I want to check out Matt's work, and some Cemetery Dance author Ian Rogers is in there, an author I'm fond of. We were talking about Bigfoot before we got on. Ray Cluley has a fantastic, really unique Bigfoot story in his collection. Cool. I reviewed it over on Cemetery Dance Online. I'm looking forward to Nightmare Abbey. This is Nighttime. If you're just tuning in, this is Nighttime Logic. You can connect with us or stay connected by hitting like or subscribe on YouTube. I'm not sure what that is. And we do have a Facebook page and a Facebook group. So that's a good way to stay connected with us. So let's get back to talking about These Things Linger. One of the things I wanted to ask you, Dan, is folklore gets introduced into the book in a really interesting way. I think it first gets brought up by Matt, by Uncle Matt's friend Buzz. He starts to bring folklore in, as you described. Like at first, it's just sort of on the periphery, but then it becomes really important to the story. What's your feelings on folklore? Like, what's the connection, or what's one of the connections between folklore and horror, and particularly horror that's written today? Why do you think if you think they go well together, why do you think they go well together? And what's the appeal? I think it's really enjoying a resurgence or a popularity right now.
I mean, I love folklore based horror. It's a lot of folklore is giving a face to something that seems inexplicable or to some massive presence that is heavy in your life. I mean, just using, all right, like the Filipino, there's a belief in a sort of vampire creature called an aswang, and but it's what it represents. The actual creature of is some sort of mythological creature, but what it leads to is infertility and death and unexpected child loss, things like that, and that fits in with the culture that they were having issues with at the time when it became a big figure. Like you can look at any sort of, you can look at, there's a creature in, I want to say Austria, where in some mountains nearby, where they believe something is out there that will rip the tendons off your ankles while you're climbing in the mountains and build its own shoes. There's all these different facets of, because people get lost in the mountains and die there, and they find them mauled because they've been eaten by animals. I mean, but so they make it becomes a creature, becomes a presence of something more. It works for good too, but usually it's something a little bit nasty. And I like the horror that plays on these nasty embodiments of things that are real, but it gives a face and a presence and a entity to something that is just terrible things in your life. And it's fascinating. It's beautiful.
You're describing like creatures and a kind of horror that's born out of the hopes and fears of people from a certain region. I mean, like, horrors are born out of our hopes and fears, but like the two that you just mentioned are very regional specific, but more so than just being regional. It's about the real life hopes and fears of people, fears of fertility, of life, of being lost in the mountains, of fear of just of being prey. And that definition really, it really makes sense to see these things really do come into play in
and it resonates in so many books. And this has something of being afraid of what you pass on to your kids. That's a worry. I mean, when you have a pregnant wife and you start dabbling in blood magic, you got to be worried about what you're doing. And it works the same way for all sorts of stuff. It's just cool.
We're backing up to a question Lisa asked before your reading. Did this book frighten your wife?
A bit. She's not a huge into reading horror stuff. She's not huge into horror in general. I inflicted a bunch of horror movies on her when we first started dating, and I don't think she's ever forgiven me. But she read it. She liked the book. She did like it, which is cool. But she was very she read it after, I believe she read it after she read it while she was still pregnant. I think she didn't like that part too much.
Yeah.
That was not her favorite part of the.
I can imagine. Well, Alex's wife, Rachel, plays an increasingly big role in the book. In the second part of the book, Alex and Rachel, they go through a lot of things to try to solve this problem, to try to get out of the trouble. We won't go into spoiler territory. To get out of the trouble, the supernatural trouble, the folklore-ish trouble that's ailing them. And one of the things they do is they enlist the services of a psychic. And there was a cool line. One of the things I do is I run the New York Ghost Story Festival, which is since the pandemic, it's been an online exploration of ghost stories and all things ghostly. And so there was this line that really flagged my interest. I think one of the things when they're talking with the psychic, we get the notion put out there that ghosts are how the ghosts, they see themselves and we fill in the rest. And that can you elaborate on your unique notion of perceiving ghosts?
For me, I mean, if you're taking ghosts at face value, we always have stories about how we see this ghost wearing the Victorian dress or wearing this thing that we all know of them. But if they're really to be ghosts, they see themselves as something different. We put onto them what we transfer onto them what we perceive of how they lived and who they were, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's who they were. There's two different viewpoints, and it's the ghost itself is a marriage between that entity and us, and how we see it is reflected on one side we see ours and on the other side is theirs. And it's kind of it's just a meeting ground, and that's a lot of what this is a transition between first seeing it as he imagines it, and then the ghost's actual thing sort of leaching through. There's a lot of that in general, though, and it's just a cool idea of how you see ghosts. I mean,
Yeah, it comes into. I mean, there's a lot. There's a lot of things going on in these things linger. I mentioned the folklore, but yeah, there's a ghost story. It's a really cool, unique ghost story as well. Do you have some favorite ghost stories, or what do you think the appeal of the ghost story
I
is?
mean, I think there's, I can't remember. I'm talking about how every supernatural story can kind of be reduced to a ghost story. I mean, I know that, and I also Malfi just showed up, but I remember hearing that every story Ronald Malfi tells can be called a ghost story if you stretch it, and you can see that their ghost stories. It's so much of a common theme is about what's missing or what's dead or mortality. These are the central themes of most books in general, but especially most horror that has that a supernatural edge to it. Is this the focus on something that you can lose, that can be lost, or can it be found again? And it's really interesting. I'm not sure I'm trying to think of favorite ghost stories is tricky. I grew up with some, but I don't know about any that really stand out other than the ones that used to, horrify us all as children, they were wonderful in their own way, but also I was really scared as a kid of that kind of stuff. Like
Well,
really,
you wrote a scary one yourself, and these things linger
thank
because
you.
things really. You mentioned the loss, or can things be found, and at the point where it becomes the ghostly aspect of the story, Alex and Rachel are desperately trying to find that peace, to find that peace of mind, to find that life of rationality again. And they're trying, and things are not things are getting worse, things are escalating. There's another cool aspect that you bring into the story. Tell us about the creature that you call the Ghost Eater.
Well, I figured that, I mean, ghosts would be
So
afraid of things too, and if there's things out there, there's something eating it. I mean, that's just the rule of nature of everything. It's sort of comforting, but sort of not comforting. I mean, I can't remember the quote from Whalefall where Daniel Cross says something about how it's the one unifying feature in all of life is that we all are part of something else sooner or later. And if you have ghosts, there's going to be something. Otherwise, we'd be haunted all over the place. So
I
there
love
are,
that. I love that notion.
but there's something else out there that is coming after them, and something that wants more ghosts. And if ghosts come about by your misery and your pain and your torment and strife, well, this thing's invested in making sure you feel those, so that way it can feed on you too, and continue to do so.
I love that you have this whole. Sometimes world building is how you put it in the natural world. Sometimes people refer to it as the ecology of the supernatural. How you very effortlessly built this believable system of ghosts, of why the characters are seeing this, what the ghosts mean to them, and then going back to how we were talking about a thriller, and there's a mystery, there's a pace, and things escalate. Yeah, this concept of the ghost eater comes in, where it's just like, wow, I didn't think of that, and like, wow, now we're dealing with this. We just wanted this, and the stakes are really escalating. The unique and individual elements are really shining through in the book. So yeah, and then it made me think of, wow, we could also call this book. It's got the folklore, we've got the ghosts, but it's got the elements of a monster book.
I know I love
Do
monster
some
books.
late. And yeah, so what are some of your favorite? We all love monsters. What is the appeal of the monster story? Why do readers love them? What are some of your favorites?
Well, I mean, I think probably my first one that I just truly loved was got to be Jurassic Park, just because they took something that seemed so silly. I don't know, I was an 8-year-old kid or something reading like, oh, this is gonna be dumb. It's dinosaurs. I hadn't really watched the movie because I was scared as hell of the birds by Alfred Hitchcock. So I wasn't up for movies at that point, but I was like, a book I can do.
That's an escalation. Birds to the dinosaurs, despite
Yeah.
the evolutionary connection.
Did not work out. I was absolutely terrified. The book is beautiful, fantastic, but when it shows up and it's real, and you feel like, oh, this isn't just some threat to. This isn't a person. This is something that is bigger, scarier, and a whole lot nastier than me on an elemental, intrinsic level. I am afraid. I am threatened, as I can be ripped limb from meaty little limb and devoured. And there's something so just inherently primally dreadful about that it's great. I love monsters and books and movies and stuff. It's
So for you, it connects to the body horror element of, I think I saw a show once that was talking about the different elements of horror, or the different aspects. Like there's psychological, or there's ghostly, and then there's a kind of horror where it's like the visceral fear of your body being invaded, that fear of like the people in the Alps. You mentioned the Alps, like we have a fear of being ripped to shreds by an animal out there, but that also,
and monsters are the marriage point between those. Monsters are the meeting point. Like there is some failed manuscript laying on the ground where it talks about where the idea was the gun is magic to the deer. I mean, if for us these things seem supernatural, but for the monster it's not supernatural. It's just what they do, and we are just a tiny blip. We're not that significant to them. I mean, that's cool. That's great.
That's a great notion of cosmic horror, and it's just a great notion of perception of the supernatural, right? Like the gun is magic to the deer. How much of the things that we experience in our life, or that we horror writers write about, how much of that is quote unquote something natural that maybe science doesn't understand yet? I mean, maybe there is complete magic and complete supernatural out there, but hey, maybe when they're looking back at us 100 years from now, they'll be like, oh, how cute that they thought that. How nice that they thought that,
the sweet summer children.
Right. We're getting near the end of the show, but I wanted to talk to you about the end of the book, because we're not going to spoil it, but I love the ending of These Things Linger. I think it was a great ending, and it evoked for me one of my favorite endings, which is in a horror book, which is Stephen King's Pet Sematary. So I just wanted to talk for a minute about Pet Sematary. We have in Pet Sematary, of course, we have Louis Creed, who's a father and a husband, and like in These Things Linger, that book escalates. Things get more dangerous. The decisions become more questionable. What is it about Alex Wilson, and what does his family mean to him? How did we get to this amazing endpoint for Alex?
I mean, it's with going with Creed, he makes every decision along the way seems borderline rational and believable. With just going to Pet Sematary, yes, some of them are bad, and you're like, I wouldn't do that, but you understand where it's coming from. Like you know how in that moment you might do that, and you might be willing to look past what's. I mean, I don't know if Pet Sematary can really be spoiled, considering it's pretty well known.
We all know it's part of our pantheon now. We know how Pet Sematary ends.
You lose a son, though. What wouldn't you do to get them back? Even if there's just a chance of it working, and it probably won't, but maybe this time it will. And that whole driving force of trying so hard to put things back together, and then at the end you look at what you've built and it's not what you meant to have. Like, you did not want it. And that kind of rhythm is something that I was hoping to emulate with it. Just that you can't always put things right, and sometimes it's just going to go bad.
Which brings our conversation full circle and back to how you started the book with that wonderful quote, and the quote from Hoosier: "Don't feed me, I will come back." And Uncle Matty giving us this warning of a fishing related theme. The novel comes full circle with these concepts. What is the appeal? It's a great structure of having that full circle, having that pattern, and maybe even ending with a horrific revelation. What is well, I'm saying these things, I'm being a little bit vague just to not spoil it for people who haven't read it yet. But what's the appeal? What's the appeal in that structure, that revelation, that gut punch, that ending sort of reveal that seems to be really go hand in hand with a lot of great horror novels?
It's just, I mean, it's some of my favorite part is the just the circular nature of it. It changes the whole book that you read before, using I Am a Legend, which just is the best example of it ever. I mean, you read this and you're rooting for the guy all along, and at the end you realize somewhere along the way he's the monster. He is, and it's terrible because you've agreed with every decision he made, and then you look at it, you realize the whole time you were wrong, and there's something. Then you reread it, and it's so different the second time through. And I'm using the mouth of Little Girls has a similar sort of thing. You read this, and the ending changes the whole book leading up to it. It just completely shifts it all into a new perspective, and you just want, as soon as you're done, you want to go back to page one and start reading again. And
I love that. I love when a book does that. I love when an ending can be a lens to re-examine your perception of the book, or a great title does that as well. You're like, oh, and your book definitely does that. So,
Thank you.
So that's a great place to end our conversation. Again, this is These Things Linger. It's out now from Cemetery Dance by Dan Franklin. Dan, thank you so much for talking to me about the book. I enjoyed it. It was great talking to you. Thanks to our friends and colleagues who are out there tuning in. And again, and it's a cold New York night. It was great to talk about these creepy and ghostly and folkloric things.
Also,
so
Daniel Brum, he has cool books out. Night Marches is a fantastic collection.
Well, I'm proud to be a fellow Cemetery Dance author with you. Yeah. Hey, before we go, speaking of Cemetery Dance, are there any great Cemetery Dance? I know you are all things Cemetery Dance. What are some great trade paperbacks that you're excited about that people can look forward to?
In the next 6 months, we have all sorts of cool stuff. We have Alan Baxter book coming out, Blood Covenant. It just got the cover, and it is so good. We have Hollow Girls, which has like a fairy horror, which, man, the ending to it just. We just got a Sasquatch Bigfoot type one out called Faith of Dawn that I did not see. There was huge parts that I did not see coming. I mean, we have collections by Thomas Smith. We have Place Sarita, which has Lisa Morton. I mean, Lisa Morton's incredible. There's so many good books that are coming up in the next circuit. I'm sure I'm forgetting a few, but I don't mean to slight the people that I'm forgetting.
Yeah, well, you're just giving us a taste. You're not slighting anyone. But yeah, hey, surf on over to Cemetery Dance Online to check out. And I know there's a lot of exciting news coming up for These Things Linger, and whatever your taste in horror, I think the trade paperback line is sure to please you. So I'm proud to be a small part of it with you, Dan. Thanks so much, and we'll talk to you soon. We'll see you next month with Gwendolyn Keist. We're gonna log out, and thank you for coming. Take care, everyone.